Welcome to the Ernie Chambers Show.
I'm Ernie Chambers, back with you again, and I cannot help but speak about the COVID-19 pandemic. There are still people who do not believe that it's real. There are still people who, even if they believe the pandemic may be real, don't trust the vaccines. So under whatever excuse or reason they give, these people do not get vaccinated and they don't want to wear a mask. I'm not going to take the first part of the program to talk about that because I'll talk about it later, but I want to read from an article dealing with a situation that was very distressing to a lot of people because it was caught and put on social media. And this appeared in the World Herald on Friday. The headline is "Maskless Cougher No Longer Employed." A maskless woman who coughed at customers at a Lincoln grocery store no longer works at her job following a company investigation. Videos posted online from the incident last Friday show the woman openly coughing in the produce section of the Super Saver near 27th Street and Pine Lake Road in Lincoln. On one video, she claimed she had allergies and said she did not need to wear a mask. After the incident went viral, people responding online wrongly identified a different woman as the coughing Karen. Karen is the general name they give to these white women who do bad things and create problems, usually for Black people, by lying. Tuesday, the maskless cougher was identified as an Arizona woman with Lincoln connections. On Wednesday morning, software company SAP, I don't know what those letters stand for, but if you take it as a word, it would spell SAP, but each one is capitalized. That company tweeted, quote, "The health and safety of our employees and the communities in which we live and work are of utmost concern to us. We are taking the matter of an SAP employee incident very seriously and investigating the situation." By Wednesday night, SAP tweeted, quote, "We have reviewed the incident and can confirm that the individual in question no longer works for SAP." The Lincoln Police Department has not received any report about the incident and does not have an investigation, said Officer Aaron Spilker, the department's public information officer. "If someone came," Spilker said, "the department would investigate to determine if any laws were violated." In a separate statement, the department said, quote, "While viewing this incident may be disturbing to some viewers, enforcement is predicated on statements and evidence from those actually at the scene." The department said it received a complaint from the woman wrongly identified, reporting online harassment and repeated offensive phone calls to her workplace. Those actions, the department said, are potential criminal violations. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues, Lincoln is under a mask mandate implemented by the Lincoln Lancaster County Health Department. On the online forum Reddit, a user identified as Jessa Bird wrote that she and her child were at the grocery store when the maskless woman approached. One video shows the woman walking forward and coughing. "Excuse me, I'm coming through." She says other shoppers are so cute. "You're such a Karen," one person responds, to which the maskless woman says, "Okay, whatever, you're such a sheep," unquote. Someone asks her why she's not wearing a mask, and she replies, "Because I don't need to have one on because I'm not sick and neither are you," unquote. She then openly coughs more and steps forward saying, quote, "It's my allergies. I have allergies, unquote. The woman who posted the Reddit to Reddit said she continued shopping, but the maskless woman followed her around the store and used the self-checkout stand next to her. Jessa Bird posted, quote, I just really wanted to get us the heck out of there, unquote. She called the incident bizarre and weird. She added, quote, it's a huge problem when a grown adult resorts to spewing their unmasked germs all over strangers in a public setting. That can be said about all people who are so inconsiderate. When the AIDS pandemic became well known, people who had AIDS and infected somebody else could be charged criminally. They had this disease. They didn't notify the person they were dealing with. The person contracted AIDS and the spreader was criminally prosecuted. That seems to be a difference in handling because gay people were deemed to be the ones who caught and spreaded AIDS. In this case, there are people like governors, Congress people, President Trump, and a lot of others who should know better and may know better, who are advocating that masks not be worn, that people not be vaccinated, that this whole thing is a conspiracy. And there are foolish people in this country who are buying that. There are people who were vaccinated and they got COVID. That does happen to some people. But here is the rub. If somebody who's been vaccinated has COVID and comes to the hospital, one of those who doesn't believe COVID exists and is not vaccinated gets to go to the front of the line. And that has been very disgusting, not only to the families of those who had COVID and were at the hospital first and had been vaccinated, but to doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers. And they are growing weary. Before I go into that too much, I said I was going to talk about something else because I could spend another program on that. And some people don't want to hear it, but here are a couple of things I'll deal with that maybe they will listen to. I have never thought anything of Donald Trump, even before he became president and had that program called The Apprentice and would have people kowtowing, Uncle Toming, Aunt Jemimaing to him, white and black, trying to be approved by him. And if he didn't like him, he said, you're fired. Pop his finger and they're gone. When he was running for president, allegations were common of him having groped women in their crotch, and he joked about it. There was a man who had a television program, and he pointed out what Trump had said. When you're famous, women will let you do anything to them, and if they don't want you to, you can do it anyway. And he laughed and joked about it. Then when it came out, because this guy spilled the beans, he wanted to say he was kidding, and his wife said, well, he was just engaging in locker room talk. Now, she'd been in America 10 years and couldn't speak English without that heavy accent, yet she and the Trumpites are opposed to people who come here from Mexico. And having spent less time than she has in this country, will actually learn the language and speak it clearly enough for you to understand it. And they certainly did the work that Americans didn't want to do. And now these people who are growers out in California, not right this minute because of the wildfires and so forth, and not just California, but that part of the country where agriculture is part of the backbone of their economy, saying that they can't get workers because so many are being stopped at the border. These people were exploited by Americans who didn't mind treating them like human chattels. But I had written some things to the newspaper from time to time would be printed. This one, I think I'll take them chronologically. That means one after the other based on when they were written. You all know that. I'm just having a little fun with you as I get my papers straightened out for myself. Okay, I must have gotten them in order before I came. This one was written and it was printed at any rate in the Lincoln Journal Star, October of 2017. I told you so on Trump is the headline. This is what I wrote and they printed it. It can be gratifying and satisfying to make before the fact assessments that are vindicated by events. It means you properly picked what was going to happen. President Donald Trump recently manifested embarrassing intellectual, moral, and character deficiencies on two highly visible stages. At the United Nations, he spouted intemperate, insulting, threatening, inflammatory words against North Korea and its leader, creating a situation evocative of the Chinese proverb, quote, "He who rides a tiger is afraid to dismount," unquote. This is especially true if the rider is himself a paper tiger uttering empty threats, and Trump loved to do that. Commander-in-chief had never been in the military, dodged the draft and military service by saying he had sore feet, but he was given very dangerous toys, namely nuclear weapons to play with. And nothing is more dangerous than a weak man with strong weapons and no self-control. Going on. More recently, while posing with top military leaders, he uttered the ominous but cryptic statement, "Maybe it's the calm before the storm," suggesting that maybe something was going to happen to North Korea. In Alabama, the land of George Wallace, Ku Klux Klan, cross burnings, bombed Black churches, Bloody Selma, and segregation for Alva, Trump addressed a raucous, adoring white crowd driven into a frenzy. There he used an obscenity, the crass SOB, and I won't say the three words, everybody knows what they stand for, but he used them at that time. And I didn't write the words out in this column. I put in parentheses, he used the explicit words. To criticize and condemn strongly predominantly Black NFL players who during the national anthem silently protest police violence and racial injustice by taking a knee. And as I've told you, the one who wrote the poem that became the national anthem, Francis Scott Key, was a slaveholder and had the nerve to write about this place, the land of the free and the home of the brave, and he himself was a slaveholder. And this is the man they want our children to be taught is a hero, but they don't want any children taught about the fact that Francis Scott Key and others were slaveholders, but I'll get into that after a while. Trump sent Vice President Mike Pence, who is called his lapdog, on a fool's errand to attend last Sunday's Indianapolis Colts game with specific instructions, a command to walk out if players protested, which some did. And Pence obediently followed orders. The stunt cost taxpayers more than $250,000 or $250,000 to fly him and his entourage to Indianapolis for that stunt and that fool's error perpetrated by former President Donald Trump, whom these ignorant white people still worship, and the scheming ones still exploit. Trump's unpresidential fulminations were quoting St. Paul the Apostle as sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal. Trump is, in the words of Shakespeare, but a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and his ranting is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Unquote. My before the fact assessment was set forth in a Journal Star article titled Chambers Seeks Trump's Removal, and that was several months before this was written. His actions spawned my legislative resolution calling on federal officials to invoke the 25th Amendment to the US Constitution to expel Trump from office because of his unfitness. It was introduced too late in the session to force a vote. The pertinent part of that article said, Chambers said Trump's foreign policy decisions, particularly those regarding North Korea and the Middle East, have the potential to do great harm to Americans. The president has behaved like, quote, a deranged, drunken idiot. Remember what I said, deranged and idiot, because I'm going to touch on that in a few minutes, where somebody other than myself was speaking. And that he underestimated Kim Jong-un, insulting the Korean leader and stirring him to test more missiles. Just the other day, North Korea tested a new missile that covered a distance of 500 miles and landed where it was supposed to in the sea. Kim Jong-un is not crazy. He is not a fool, and he is a much faster learner than Donald Trump, unquote. And Kim is still in office. Despite Trump's bellicose huffing and puffing, the nuclear sky is not yet falling, Chicken Little. However, in the horrific event, and this is, I hope you'll pay attention to, in the horrific event that a Trump blunder triggers an exchange of nuclear devices between the US and North Korea, creating twin towers of global destruction. Instructive is the fear, panic, havoc, and devastation wrought by Hurricanes Harvey and Irma. These were mere unthinking wind and water without the rocket's red glare and the bombs bursting in air. Yet they created havoc and caused great terror. And no wall can prevent radiation fallout from drifting like the smoky haze from West Coast wildfires. I'm going to take a turn here. One of the two reporters who broke the story of Watergate, Bob Woodward, the other was Bernstein, just released a book called Peril, and it quotes the then top general in the United States. And he gave instructions as Trump's deterioration mentally became more evident, that because of the possibility that he may do something foolish, such as giving, and I'm shortening it up, the order to launch nuclear weapons of some kind, don't carry out such an order. Don't do what he says without consulting directly with me. And at the time he made these statements, all of the other generals at the top levels were there. And the book said he looked each one in the eye and asked, did they understand? And gave the directive to all those who would have anything to do with the nuclear launch to go through the procedure and don't do what Trump said. And the procedure was to verify it with certain people. And this general said, I am a part of that procedure. Nothing is to be done without my approval, direction, and order. And at the same time, he called the head of China, who had heard some of the bellicose or warlike statements of Trump toward China when the pandemic was blamed on China, to tell the head of China that no attack would be made against China, that he would assure that such would not happen. Time passed, things got worse, and he called the Chinese leader again and said, should there be an attack ordered, it will not be carried out. He talked to Nancy Pelosi, and she said this latest thing that Trump had been talking about shows how crazy he is. And this is one of the most crazy of the crazinesses that he's been involved in. And the general reassured her that nothing was going to be allowed without his order. Now, that came out in this book that has just been released. Here is something that I said April 3rd of 2018, 3 years ago, before I'd read anything by any general. When I offered my resolution, the legislature referred it to the, I think it was the Government, Veterans and Military Affairs Committee, chaired by a Republican who would not schedule it for a hearing. It was late in the session. So I said, if you don't schedule it for a public hearing, I'm going to make a motion on the floor to pull it out of your committee, and I'll have my debate on the floor anyway. So he scheduled it, but over the noon hour, when not many people would be able to come. But nevertheless, I went and I wanted a record. And I'm not going to read everything that took place in that hearing, except this part. Here's what I will say. It's not said to shock anybody. And maybe, now I always promote people who've been in the military. Maybe General Brewer, he was a colonel. He had been wounded several times in combat. We got along very well. Maybe General Brewer would feel that I shouldn't say it. But I think if there's any group as a whole who've thought about being in the military, any one of them knows what the oath is that is taken. And they take it very seriously. The country means something genuine to such people, not the John Wayne type characters portrayed in the movie, but those who really are genuine about this. Patriotism is more than a word. Loyalty is more than a slogan. The badges, the bits of metal and ribbon are outer testimonies to the world of what they've done up to that point, what you ought to have done. I don't think that President Trump would ever be obeyed if he gave an order to launch nuclear weapons. I didn't know a general was going to say that, but this was me expressing my view, observing what was happening and the danger that Trump posed. I'll repeat that. I don't think that President Trump would ever be obeyed if he gave an order to launch nuclear weapons. He would not be obeyed. I think the janitor who works for the president, if he saw the president pick up the red phone, he'd pull the plug out of the wall, because that's all that he could do. If the president reached the button, the janitor might, if he had the means, cut his hand off. Now I'm going to skip. I think a military man or woman would sacrifice life to save the country. That person would understand that there is no winner once the nuclear weapons begin to be activated. No place on earth would people be safe. Maybe all of humankind would be wiped out, and maybe not. But this person would be well aware of how unprepared any country is to intercept all the missiles that might be directed. If some get through, then not just the blast, not just the heat, but the lingering radioactivity contamination would continue to kill for nobody knows how long. So I think this person would be the one that I talked about in my one act, one scene play. The general who is facing court martial. And I described that with his buttons. He's standing ramrod straight, his hat under his arm. And he would give this little speech about every one of you at the table. There were generals. As I stated before, no person facing a court martial has a judge lower in rank than he or she would be. And he's talking to these generals. Every one of you took the same oath that I did, that you would defend this country and protect it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Every one of you, as I have done, has been on the battlefield risking my life as you've risked yours protecting this country from enemies, foreign, and many people forget, domestic. If any of you were in the position I was in when I acted, you would have done exactly as I did. That ended his speech. And then I said, rather than tell what he did, there would be a headline in the morning paper. General so-and-so was tried by court martial, sentenced to death for assassinating the President of the United States. The president would just be one man. That title, commander-in-chief, would just be words. And in the same way that this general had risked life on a battlefield, maybe just to protect a piece of land, just to save his own life, would be willing to do what was necessary to save the country and maybe humanity. One small act by one man, one giant service for humanity, and then he would die like a soldier, and they would shoot him. They wouldn't hang him. That's demeaning, that is degrading, and in England, to show that it was reserved for sneak thieves, robbers, and pickpockets. And that ended my presentation to that committee. There are people who are willing to do whatever they think is necessary to achieve a greater good, even if it means sacrificing self. So I wanted to throw that in at this point because I've been writing things and saying things on the floor of the legislature, pointing out how deranged Donald Trump is and had shown himself to be. I'm gonna read these other two things, then I'm going to go into something else. Oh, because that one that I read was telling how good it is to say I told you so. This is President Trump's 5 principles. And I may have read this before. Sometimes I get a little forgetful, but sometimes there are things which bear repeating. This was June of 2019. An appropriate introduction to the 5 principles exemplified to date by the erratic Trump regime is the following list. Then it lists several things which are identified by number. The 14 points of President Woodrow Wilson presented in his January 8th, 1918 message to Congress, the 10 commandments carted down from Mount Sinai by Moses, every one of which, by the way, has been broken, and some of them by Moses himself. The famed 7 wonders of the world, then the infamous 6-day Middle East war. The 5 principles of Trump. 1, the US Constitution in the hands of an unprincipled political strongman with the proclivity to do so to employ it in such a way, is the ideal instrument or pathway by which to ordain and establish a constitutional dictatorship, aided and abetted by a sycophantic, that's a bootlicking Senate, and a supine, that's a spineless Supreme Court. And that's what Trump was doing, turning this country into a dictatorship. He, by his using his pen, which he had no authority to do, issued orders that violated longstanding laws, longstanding, properly enacted rules and regulations. But now he's a weak man with strong weapons. So he had, in effect, ensconced himself as a dictator. Two, would-be dictator Trump, borrowing from Lord Thomas Babington Macaulay, arrived on the political scene ready, booted, and spurred to ride and corral millions of compliant Americans ready, saddled, and bridled to be ridden. He is referred to as their bays, whom he said he loved because he loves uneducated people, but not one of them has ever been invited to dinner. Three, a mentally unstable, erratic, weak man with strong weapons is volatile, unpredictable, and dangerous in the extreme in a jumpy world on nuclear tenterhooks with an itchy finger on a hair trigger. Now, this was written 3 years ago, before that general had given his orders to people, don't carry out his orders. 4, children of whatever age should never be allowed to play with matches. 5, a pyromaniac, that's somebody who starts fires, an arsonist, infatuated with fires. A pyromaniac should be barred from keeping and bearing a blazing torch in a gunpowder factory. Goes back to what I was pointing about with regard to his mental instability, and which that general had in mind when he said, don't carry out any of those kind of orders. While campaigning for the presidency, Trump asserted, I love uneducated people, which is the perfect lead-in to the words of another would-be dictator. All propaganda has to be popular and has to adapt its spiritual level to the perception of the least intelligent of those towards whom it intends to direct itself. The great masses of the people will more easily fall victims of a big lie than to a small one. Adolf Hitler and Mein Kampf. And that's the policy Trump pursued. And fortunately, there was a general who was prepared to stand between Trump and annihilation of no telling how many people, and maybe humankind. This headline to the article, Trump lightning mood abroad. If indeed laughter is the best medicine, then President Donald Trump filled the role of Dr. Feelgood by administering a dose to dour world leaders congregating at the recent NATO summit in Europe. While giving him his propers for providing a bit of laughter to a part of the world sorely in need of some, they were laughing at him because of the stupid things he was saying with reference to Russia and just his general lack of knowledge about foreign policy. They were actually laughing and the cameras caught it. I cannot say that his performance advanced his touted goal to make America great again, even though it did provide a bit of laughter to the world who needs it. In fact, well, let me put it this way, a little rhyme. And POTUS, P-O-T-U-S, is President of the United States. That's what POTUS stands for. The presidency, although itself not in hoc, POTUS is an international laughing stock. Upon the world stage, 'tis now all the rage, the US president and America to mock. America never was great. And when Trump talks about making America great again, he means when they had slavery, they undermined other governments, they supported dictatorships that destroyed not only the rights of the people, but their lives literally. That's when America considered itself great. Now, I'm going to touch on something else before I get to the COVID matter, which some people I'm sure don't want to hear about. This appeared in the Omaha World Herald last Saturday. History lesson shows the need for CRT, which is that activity that white people branded critical race theory for the purpose of attacking it. And I wrote this. Occasionally, a fortuitous revelatory confluence of events presents an opportunity to foster enlightenment. The events, number one, the raucous furor against CR2T, as I pointed out, critical race theory, and number two, cash rewards proffered for tips leading to apprehension of human traffickers. Rather than undertake to enlighten by way of a point-by-point refutation of the yowlings of the anti-CR2ers, contemporary Luddites, those were people in early days of England who destroyed machinery because they thought it was going to take work from the workers. So anytime somebody's called a Luddite, they are ignorant. They resort to violence to destroy that which they don't understand. Anyway, the yowlings of the CRTers, contemporary Luddites, whose pernicious goal is expungement of embarrassing racist American history, I shall make my point via the amendment I propose before the 2020 legislative session to an anti-human trafficking bill. I had the amendment printed in the Legislative Journal for the record and discussed it in detail, but did not force a vote because I had no desire to hinder or delay passage of the bill. Once an amendment is filed on the floor, it's put in the Legislative Journal, which exists forever as a part of the history. So it's there. And this is the amendment. Given the subject matter and intent of this bill, it shall be considered within the context of the sordid history of America relative to human trafficking and sexual exploitation visited upon enslaved persons by slaveholders. Therefore, it is appropriate to recognize and acknowledge some of the most renowned members of the All-American Pantheon and Register of Human Traffickers, which is hereby created. And you know that these vicious, low-down white men were having sex with these Black slave women. So in addition to degrading these women, they were whoremongers because money was exchanged to get these women. They were adulterers because they were married. They were Christian, upstanding, white leaders and founding fathers of this country who went outside of wedlock to force their sexual actions on enslaved women who, if they resisted, would be beaten to within an instant of their life and sometimes beaten to death. So picture that. A naked Black woman, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, all these I'm gonna mention, with an erection, got wives at home in their marriage bed, and he's down there with an erection, forcing his attentions on a Black woman and has a whip to make sure she doesn't resist. And if she does, he's able to force her. And by the way, old Thomas Jefferson, he bred slaves for sale. And he was one of the ones who produced these babies on these women who would be sold like livestock at market. And these are matters of history. These are things that these white people don't want taught. but there are history books and there are accounts contemporaneous with all this stuff going on. So they can't erase it from history. They just want to erase it from American education. And if the only way your country can have any status is by lying, misrepresenting, and altering and erasing history, that can hardly be a recipe for true greatness. Charter members of this all-American pantheon and register of human trafficking: President George Washington, President Thomas Jefferson, all men are created equal, President James Madison. Some people know, well, these famous papers that are written, some for and some against adoption of the Constitution. President Andrew Jackson, President James Monroe, Alexander Hamilton, the one about whom that play Hamilton was presented. And Alexander Hamilton was rumored to have some African blood in him because he was born in the islands where slavery was rampant. And some people accused him of being Black, which some white people don't want mentioned either. And if he was, it just shows that he was a traitor to his race. Patrick Henry, who said, "Give me liberty or give me death," he was a slaveholder and a trafficker. Francis Scott Key, who wrote those words, "The land of the free and the home of the brave," all these are slaveholders. John Hancock, that insurance company named after him. The family fortune of the Hancocks, built by smuggling. John Hancock, slave smuggler. Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Roger Brooke Taney, who was a strong, staunch Roman Catholic, who infamously said, and this is deemed one of the worst decisions ever handed down by the United States Supreme Court, and this is the judgment by white constitutional scholars even: Black men have no rights that a white man is bound to respect. Such a register should be kept, maintained, and prominently displayed in a location determined by the governor and accessible for public viewing. Additional names accompanied by factual documentation supporting placement on such a register may be submitted by any person to the governor for consideration. And the amendment, but I didn't put it all in this because it was kind of technical and it didn't add to the point I wanted to make. There would be a 3-judge committee comprising the governor, the attorney general, the secretary of state. They would review the documentation and see if these whose names were to be put on reach the level and standard of viciousness of these original 10. And if their names were rejected, they could later on be offered again with additional supporting evidence to show that they were as rotten as these first 10. Then this is the conclusion. This was not in the amendment. This is just a historical fact. Due to his having owned hundreds of slaves, Washington was invoked and claimed as one of their own by Southern secessionists to profit from his prestige, even as they sought to destroy the Union. The Southern secessionists at that time trying to destroy the Union invoked the name of George Washington, a slaveholder like them, to sanctify their cause, which was slavery. And that's why they wanted to bring down the Union, because they wanted to keep their slaves. You know what a Copperhead was? A Northerner who supported slavery. And they talked, historians did, and people of the day, about the lords of the lash in the South having an unholy alliance with the lords of the loom, or the clothiers, the manufacturers of clothing, who were in league with the Southern slave drivers because they needed that cotton. And the Southerners had managed for the first and only time in history to combine money and labor. And that money goes by the name capital now. Capital and labor were combined in the single person called a slave, who is black like me and thee, if you share one drop of blood originating in Africa, showing how powerful that blood is. But this is just one area that the white people want to erase from history, but they can't because it's all over the world. And even now, European children know more about American history than Americans. They know about these things I'm talking about, and they mock and scoff when America talks about freedom. A guy named Lafayette, who fought on the side of the United States during the Revolutionary War, he was one of these kind of soldiers of fortune who went wherever he thought the war was being waged for freedom. And he'd heard about Americans saying that they were being oppressed by England and they believe all men were created equal. He'd heard that, but he didn't know about the slavery. And when he found out what America was really about, he said, had he known that, he never would have drawn his sword in behalf of what America was doing. Some of the great writers of England, some people have heard about, he's called Dr. Johnson. He had written some of the famous works that people who studied English literature were familiar with. He talked about these Americans with all their talk of freedom, their yowlings and howlings about freedom were really slaveholders, debasers of human beings, denying their humanity and personhood. Oh, British people had a lot to say about this hypocritical country. So they're going to have to stop children from being taught certain things from English literature and law schools. They're not going to be able to teach in those states where CRT is banned by law about the cases that the United States Supreme Court handled that dealt with discrimination, segregation, cross-burning, bombings, lynchings, reparations, and so forth. So the law schools can't teach that. So what is a poor person to do who wants to go to law school? And all of this is going on right now in 2021 in a country that is supposed to be enlightened. You have a governor whose father embarrassed him and the whole Ricketts family by putting racist postings on the internet. Then Ricketts Jr. had to say, well, he never knew his father was racist like that because he never talked about it. Well, Ricketts himself is a racist. He right now is trying to ingratiate himself with the Trumpites because he's going to seek higher office. Governors are limited to 2 terms. He has served 1.5 terms, so he's a lame duck for 2 years, but he's trying to use as much money as he can to stack the legislature to carry through his programs in his last 2 years. There will be an election for the legislature. Every 2 years there's a legislative election because not everybody is elected the same year. Their terms are staggered. 1 year, even numbered, next year, odd numbered. But at any rate, he spent millions of dollars in the past, if you total up everything he has spent to support people, to buy people who would do his will in the legislature. What he would like to do is get enough people in the legislature during these last 2 years so he can run through a lot of very bad bills that are along the lines of what Trump and the out-and-out racists want to have to polish and burnish his desirability to get elected to the US, either Senate or the House of Representatives. That's what he's interested in. People need to read They need to understand. And all the World Herald is showing more enlightenment on these issues than it did when it was strictly under the ownership of people around here. It's now held by a company that owns newspapers all over the country. Trump and Ricketts, Ricketts, who wants to be a baby Trump, are condemned and criticized even by the World Herald. Time will tell what will be the result of all of this. I have told people, and I want to say it here for those who are watching, I am not now campaigning for the legislature. I was term limited out 2 years ago, well, January of last year. In 2 years, there will be an election, and the seat that I held in District 11 will be open. When I was in the legislature, I had a program on Channel 2, Cox, Ben Gray, Mayor Stothert, and Cox got together to take it off the air. They not only took off the program I was on, that was the basis for getting rid of the channel. I told people, this office does not belong to me. I have no proprietary ownership of this office. Anybody who wants to run is entitled to run. They have every right to run. Elections give people the opportunity to determine whether they want to keep the one in office or have somebody else. Elections are secret. Nobody knows what you write on your ballot. So publicly, you can tell a person, I'm for you. In the voting booth, you can vote against that person and nobody knows. And I would always tell people, I don't care whether you vote for me or not. Naturally, if I'm going to run, I want you to vote for me in that sense, but I'm not going to beg for money. I will not accept money. I'm not going to campaign, because by now you ought to know what I'm about. Either you like it or you don't. If you like it, you'll support me. If you don't, you won't. You put somebody else in. Then I'd add with that little smile, can't sing a lick. If you should lose me, oh yes, you'll lose a good thing. And they knew that. When I was term limited out, people asked me, would I run again in 4 years? I said, I may not even be alive 4 years from now. And those who heard it cheered. Great cheer of delight went up, but not everybody cheered. So I would tell them, if I am alive, if my health is good, if my mind is clear, I'll consider it. But that was not a guarantee. I cannot say what 2 years will bring, but I called young Senator McKinney, because I endorsed him when he ran, that if he hears rumblings about me running again in 2 years, I am not campaigning at this time for that office. I cannot say what I will do in 2 years, but if you hear anybody saying anything about me campaigning now, that is untrue. If I were to campaign, you know what it would consist of? Me being me, doing what I can, doing what I believe in, speaking my mind. And if people like that, and should my health be good, should my mind be clear, and should I decide to run, they would vote for me. But I would not beg for money. I would not go to these these rallies or whatever they call them, where candidates go there and often tell lies about what they intend to do. If you don't know me by now, you'll never, ever know me. I'm not going to take the full amount of time now, not today. And I had one other thing that I would like to touch on if I've got the time. I'm going to look at the control room if they can see me and see how much time I might have left. I think I've been shown enough fingers so I can finish this. And I don't get to see this, so I don't know if, but I had this blown up. This is a picture of the Statue of Freedom. It's called the Armed Statue of Freedom, and it's on top of the Capitol building in Washington, DC. And here is a picture from a distance so you can see what it looks like when it's on top of that Capitol building. This that I showed you was going along with an article, and this shows one of these huge Huey, I think they call it, helicopters. They put this scaffolding, metal and wood around the statue to lift it off of that Capitol building and lower it to the ground so they could refurbish it. I'm going to scamper right through this brief little thing. And this appeared May 10th, 1993. That's when they used this huge helicopter to bring that big statue down. When the Statue of Armed Freedom touched down on the Capitol Plaza shortly after dawn Sunday, a worker climbed a ladder, unhitched a web of protective straps, and kissed the bronze goddess on the cheek. A crowd of hundreds cheered as a helicopter crew plucked the statue from the U.S. Capitol dome, where it has stood guard for 130 years. Bringing the 7-ton, 19-foot 6-inch statue down from its perch, 268 feet above the ground, took months of planning. George White, Capitol architect, was obviously relieved. He said, "I told everyone that if we dropped it, I had a 7 a.m. ticket to Mexico. I've just torn that ticket up. Everything was done in the best way possible. There were not any hitches. Armed Freedom now begins 5 months of repair to mend the ravages of 13 decades of Washington weather. Pilot Max Evans flew the rear position on the bright orange Sky Crane helicopter owned by the Erickson Air Crane Company of Central Point, Oregon." Quote, "The back seat does the lift work and pickup," Evans said afterward. "I just picked it up and sat on the stand down here." This was quite a normal operation, Evans said nonchalantly. "The ground crew does quite a lot of preparation to make this go easily. When that's over, we come and do the easy part," unquote. It was making it look easy that impressed Senator Mark Hatfield, Republican from Oregon. Quote, "The smoothness and perfection with which it happened was amazing," he said. "After seeing that statue up there for all of those years, to see it come down safely was truly great," said Diane Lane, a Capitol staff member and one of the hundreds of people who rose before dawn to witness the operation. When spectators were allowed near the statue, they saw Rick Mountjoy of Annapolis, Maryland, climb a ladder and give the statue a kiss on the cheek. The workers who prepared the statue for its move from the top of the dome also got into the act. They pasted on the statue's sword and shield 2 large red, white, and blue labels which read, "Proud to be American," unquote. To prepare the hollow statue for lifting, workers had to jack it up with an internal column and slip a lifting ring under the base, White said. It had to be lifted from the bottom because it was assembled. Keep that word in mind. It was assembled in 5 sections, and we couldn't be sure that it wouldn't come apart, he said. The lifting ring will be made a permanent part of the statue's base, adding 4 inches to its height. We're doing that because if it ever has to come off again, we'll be ready and we won't have to go through all of this work again, White said. In the meantime, Armed Freedom will get a much needed cleaning. When it's finished, it's going to look like a bronze statue again instead of a corroded green statue, White said. Now, here's the question, brothers, sisters, friends, enemies. How did the statue get up there? How did the statues get up there? This is from Africa's Gift to America. Among the occupations of Negroes, as mentioned in the colonial records, are millers. These were the slaves. Millers, brewers, weavers, butchers, tanners, bakers, leather workers, shoemakers, blacksmiths, carpenters, shipwrights, brick masons, foremen, coopers, gold and silversmiths, as well as ship sailors, whalers, and ship pilots. The great colonial mansions and famous antebellum, that means before the war, structures were built by slaves, among them Monticello, Mount Vernon, the College of William and Mary. Most famous of the structures built by slave labor were the White House and the Capitol. Now, how did that statue get up there? It was a Negro slave, a highly skilled mechanic who performed the delicate and difficult task of fitting the Statue of Freedom on the dome of the Capitol. The New York Tribune, December 2nd, 1863, in an article entitled "The Negro Slave and the Statue of Freedom" says, now this is what these white people want to get out of the history books, and you all probably with the history you study didn't know this. That's why I'm trying to give you something so that my people will not continue to be destroyed, as the Bible said, for lack of knowledge. This was an article in the New York Tribune. When the bronze castings were being completed at the foundry of Mr. Mills, the foreman who had superintended the work from the beginning and who was receiving $8 a day struck and demanded $10. A Negro took the striker's place as superintendent, and the work went on. The black master builder lifted the ponderous masses and bolted them together, joint to joint, piece by piece, till they blended into the majestic freedom. A work, and that was written back there in 1863. A work on the rotunda and dome in the Capitol Library gives the name of this slave. It says, Mr. Mills at that time owned a highly intelligent slave named Philip Reed, who had been employed about his foundry as an expert and admirable workman. Mr. Reed, former slave, is now in business for himself and highly esteemed by all who know him. How many of you all knew that this was put by a slave? Got it up there. How did white people all those years later get it down? With a huge helicopter. And they're going to teach you that we are inferior. Black people, when they were brought to this country, came from civilized countries. Right now, there are over 53 countries on the continent of Africa. They did everything that a society needed to survive. They were the expert craftsmen. They were the ones who did a lot of the work that needed to be done to make it possible for this country to survive. The White House and the Capitol building, constructed by slaves. Then the article went on, many mansions owed their beauty and durability to slave artisans, says the United States Guide to Virginia. This was especially true of New Orleans, where their fine iron and grill work in mansions and churches are still highly prized mementos. And it went on to say how some of these people did get their freedom. They educated their children in Europe. They owned land. And then here's, as tailors, they were almost exclusively patronized by the elite. And then they mentioned the names of the elite families then. And due to the scarcity of skilled whites, the Negro artisan was a necessity. So a lot of the building then, a lot of the famous buildings now are there because people black like me and less free than I am today did it. So when these white ignoramuses want to erase what embarrasses America and never let come out what was done to make America great, if it ever was done by Black people, should not have their way. And I'm going to stop now and say, as I do at the end, what the canary said when he discovered that the door to his cage was open: I'm out of here.
Thank you for watching The Ernie Chambers Show. If you'd like to make suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This has been an EWC Communication production.